Your Dog's Friend is a nonprofit 501c3 whose mission is to help keep dogs out of shelters by educating and supporting their humans. We promote positive method of training and behavior modification through stress-free methods. As part of that mission, we offer free webinars like the one you're about to watch. Subjects range from dog behavior, stress-free training, and other tools to help you understand your relationship with your dog. If you liked the webinar, be sure to give us a thumbs up. Click the notification bell and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll be notified when future videos are posted. Now enjoy the webinar.
Hello everyone, welcome to your Dog's Friend webinar series. Today's webinar will help you with your dog's separation-related problems. Before we start though, let me introduce you to our speaker, Alexandria Dilley. Alexandra is a certified professional dog trainer, knowledge assessed, and the owner of Home Alone Canine, where she is focused solely on providing treatment and support for separation-related behavior problems. Before that, she was a separation anxiety trainer at Separation Anxiety and Beyond, working closely alongside and mentored by the owner, Tracy Krulik, whom you may remember from previous separation anxiety webinars. For 8 years, Alexandra was the behavior and training director at the Humane Rescue Alliance in Washington, D.C., where she developed an intensive rehab program for severely fearful dogs. She also worked with Tracy Krulik and Dr. Daniel Mills of the University of Lincoln in the UK to develop a questionnaire to evaluate changes in separation-related problems in dogs during the pandemic, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. And we will get to as many of your questions as possible, although we will hold them until the end. We also rely on donations for our free services, including these webinars. So if you are inclined to donate either during or afterward, you could go to our homepage, yourdogsfriend.org, and you will see a donations icon in the right-hand upper corner. If you do decide to donate, we'd certainly appreciate it. I know that we will all learn a lot today. Are you ready, Alexandra? It's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining me today for Home Alone, Understanding and Addressing Separation-Related Problems in Dogs. I want to discuss with you why the term separation anxiety is only a partial explanation for the distress many animals feel when left alone, and how we can help dogs to overcome it. You may be all too familiar with this type of thing. Behavior problems when home alone affect anywhere from 14 to 55% of dogs, and these may be underestimations. Usually people call this problem separation anxiety. However, research is showing that there are likely multiple emotions and motivations, not just anxiety, and that there are a wide variety of terms that have been used by researchers over the years to describe this. Researchers now believe that separation-related problems are a syndrome as opposed to a diagnosis. A syndrome is a collection of signs that consistently occur together to form a characteristic presentation, whereas a diagnosis is the identification of the nature of the problem, not simply when the problem arises. When we're trying to help dogs with separation problems, we want to know what the most effective treatments are. But in order to do that, we have to know what is causing the problem. Desensitization, Matos, Pike, Berman, and Mills in 2020 determined that there were 7 major categories of behavior that most contributed to the variation in problem behaviors that were reported. And they also identified 4 different forms of the syndrome of separation-related problems. The 7 major categories they found were exit frustration, social panic, elimination, redirected frustration, reactive communication, immediate frustration, and noise sensitivity. Exit frustration means destruction of doors and door frames or places near the exit, including flooring or large furniture or windows, as well as tearing holes in the wall. Social panic refers to vocalizing when the owner is leaving or gone, as well as other signs of distress like restlessness, agitation, pacing during pre-departure routines, or when confined, or when separated for short times from the owner. It also includes biting or clawing doors, windows, or a crate when the owner has stepped outside. Elimination is described as peeing or pooping in inappropriate places when the owner is not present. And many people believe that when a dog poops or pees while they're out, it means the dog is trying to get back at them. But researchers believe it is actually related to having more severe levels of distress. Redirected frustration refers to taking and destroying things when left alone or confined. These could be medium-sized objects or clothing. And the idea here is that they are not able to get to what they want, so they take out their frustration and energy on things nearest to them, hence the word redirected. Reactive communication occurs when the dog is not able to reach an approaching person or dog or someone unfamiliar that's nearby because of the barrier of the house. So they start barking. Thus, they're reacting to those things. And this is termed reactive communication. Immediate frustration is when the dog bites someone when not allowed to do something they're expecting to be able to do, like being put back on leash to when they want to run in the park, or turning to go home when they wanted to go on a long walk, or even growling when they're watching the owner outside talking to someone else. Noise sensitivity in this study is described as panicking and starting to destroy things when hearing screeches, whistles, fireworks, thunderstorms, or sudden loud noises like cars backfiring or things falling. In addition to the varieties of behaviors, they identified how there appear to be 4 main forms of the syndrome and different inferred psychological states for each form. For instance, in group A, the authors suspect that the dogs find being separated aversive or unpleasant, which causes them social panic. And they try to go after the owner, but they can't, and that leads to exit frustration. And they're unable to do that because of the barriers within the home, and they struggle to find an alternative way of coping, which causes redirected frustration. Group A included the smallest percentage of dogs, 17.4%. Group B contained 29% of dogs. In Group B, the author suspected that the dogs are combative and reactive to external events, and that is the reactive communication that you see, and often try to get at those things as an immediate response, which causes this exit frustration. But because they're unable to do so due to barriers of the home, they remain highly aroused and struggle to find an alternative way of coping, which leads to redirected frustration. And accordingly, these dogs find being separated from the owner aversive, where you see the social panic signs, with the rare instances of aggression towards the owner, which is that immediate frustration, indicating that the dog is more generally combative and reactive as more of a temperament trait. Group C was the largest group of dogs with 35.6%. And in Group C, the researchers believe the dogs are reactive to external events, which is reactive communication. But unlike Group B dogs, they don't typically try to get at those things. So there's not as much exit frustration. And this might be, for example, because they're more generally anxious or avoidant than dogs in Group B. This would be consistent with the absence of the owner being associated with a loss of social support, which causes their social panic, but the dogs perhaps finding some safety in the home, which reduces their arousal, which would otherwise cause redirected frustration. And the rare instances of aggression towards the owner, which is that immediate frustration, might be indicative of a more extreme nervousness in their temperament. Group D dogs made up 18% of the dogs, and the authors proposed that these dogs have learned that being alone is really unpleasant, which causes social panic due to lack of stimulation. This leads them to become more and more reactive to external events as time progresses, which may ultimately relate in that redirected frustration as they cannot escape. So separation-related problems have a huge component of frustration. Frustration is described in 4 out of the 7 varieties of separation-related problem behaviors here, including exit frustration, redirected frustration, reactive communication, and immediate frustration. And frustration is defined as a negative emotional state that appears when an animal's expectation is violated. For example, when a needed resource is inaccessible or when the reward of a previously reinforced behavior stops. Mills says that frustration involves a focus on the goal to the exclusion of other activities alongside increased effort directed towards accessing or protecting whatever resource is being denied. And Desensitization saw frustration caused by the barriers of the house that can prevent the dog from accessing the caregiver, being able to combat threats outside the house, as well as the exciting options in the outside world, and even saw frustration manifested as aggressive behavior towards the owner when they are upsetting the dog's expectations of freedom and access. Frustration is an emotional reaction, a general mood, and a temperament trait. It can arise in many different contexts, and it's related to a number of different behavior problems like resource guarding. McPeak et al. Actually developed a validated assessment for assessing frustration in dogs, where you can score your dog on 5 different factors related to frustration, including general frustration, barrier frustration, unmet expectations, autonomous control, and coping skills. Finally, it's thought that frustration may play a role in dogs' attachment styles to their caregivers. In human psychology, disorganized attachment is where the child becomes afraid of the parent. Anxious ambivalent attachment is when the parent is present and available 1 second, and then unavailable and insensitive the next. And these changes are unpredictable. These attachment styles can cause children to react with anger and frustration. And there is a theory that some dogs may have analogous attachment styles to their caregivers, which could create similar emotional reactions, including frustration. And this is one very important reason why it's so important to provide predictable interactions with our dogs and also avoid punishment. Desensitization also found that social panic is highly prevalent in all 4 forms of separation problems. So there's almost always this component of anxiety or panic around losing the caregiver or close companions. Dogs were not evolved to live by themselves. They are used to living in groups, and so this type of social experience is something that they have to be accustomed to accept. It is not normal for a puppy to know how to stay confined by themselves for hours at a time, and it's something that needs to be learned. Researchers have speculated that separation-related problems happen because certain dogs are hyper or over attached to their owners. However, there is no definition of hyper-attachment in the human literature, which makes it more complicated to understand. It has been described as either never having learned how to be independent from a parental figure, which initially is the mother dog, and then eventually that would transfer to a human, or becoming emotionally dependent again on someone after significantly negative life experiences, such as being rehomed. Thus, the dog attempts to maintain access to the caregiver to remain emotionally stable. It's difficult to determine what would qualify a dog as being hyper-attached and how that affects separation problems. Signs have included following the owner around the house, wanting to maintain close physical contact, becoming upset when the owner moves away from the dog or prepares to leave the house, excessive greetings upon the owner's return, and initiating owner interaction. However, dogs without separation-related problems will also do these things. So studies disagree on whether these signs are relevant to separation problems. Konak et al. In 2011 actually found that dogs with separation problems did not greet their owners more excitedly than dogs without them, and nor did they gravitate towards the owner's things in preference while the caregivers were gone. However, dogs with separation problems did have trouble calming down in comparison to dogs without them when the owners returned. So this idea that the owner is the base of emotional stability is still questionable. And as I mentioned before, evidence for other theories such as insecure attachment between dog and caregiver could also be the case. In addition to the fear, anxiety, and panic that would be related to the loss of an attachment figure, there are also negative emotions triggered during separation problems when the dog thinks there's an external threat. And in the Desensitization paper, dogs in groups B and C responded to external threats with high levels of reactivity. However, dogs in group B were more combative, showing more frustration-related behaviors than dogs in group C, which seemed more fearful. A few dogs in all of the groups showed fears of noises as well, and Sagi Denenberg, the veterinary behaviorist, labels the intense fear or anxiety when encountering sounds as phonophobia, and says that there are actually two subcategories of phonophobia, one related to more obvious sounds like fireworks, thunder, and gunshots, and the other related to lower level sounds like traffic noises, people talking, or sneezing. And it's fascinating because research has found that the subcategory that shows more lower level phonophobia also has more separation related distress. But they did not find that in dogs who had fears of more intense sounds like fireworks. And I bring that up because I do see hypervigilance in some dogs that have relaxed through the departure process, but still become anxious after being alone for a while. And in my experience, there seems to be a connection with fear of unfamiliar things, low-level sounds, and separation-related problems. It's very important to treat the causes of these fears if we want to help our dogs relax while alone. That will include helping them escape exposure to those things through the use of den-like areas we call safe havens, as well as talking to your vet or a veterinary behaviorist about assessing your dog for an anti-anxiety medication that could help with these types of fears if your dog is distressed. Finally, think of the group D dogs that were suffering due to a lack of stimulation, which caused them to become more reactive and frustrated over time when they could not escape. When we are looking at things we can do to help our dogs across the board to lessen separation-related problems and improve their overall quality of life, I cannot think of one that will give us more bang for our buck than increasing physical and cognitive stimulation to lessen boredom. In the animal welfare world, we refer to increasing stimulation in a way that improves the dog's quality of life as enrichment. And within that, I will include exercise. Boredom leads to immense frustration, and over time, research has shown that anxiety responses increased after initial frustration. We believe since the animal could not escape their confinement. There is a great book on this topic, which I would highly recommend, called Canine Enrichment for the Real World by Ali Bender and Emily Strong. And in it, they define different types of enriching activities that you can rotate on a daily basis. Those include chews, positive reinforcement-based dog training activities, frozen food treats, scents, sounds, and foraging toys, forms of physical activity and social interaction with other dogs and people that your dog finds fun. And they make a really important point that enrichment isn't just about doing an activity, but in fact, when something is really enriching for your dog, it will actually change their behavior in a positive way. I think that this is the standard we should be looking at when we provide enriching activities for dogs, but especially those with separation-related problems. Remember that novelty is very important. For instance, taking a walk outside your neighborhood rather than in your neighborhood could offer a much more enriching experience for almost the same amount of effort. In the Desensitization paper, depression was actually the second most observed behavior during separation after vocalization. It occurred in 52% of respondents' dogs during separation. However, it did not show up in defining the varieties of separation-related behavior problems because likely it did not explain the different contexts and behavioral signs well, as it's often a lack of behavior. Sagi Denenberg says that the issue of depression is controversial in animals because we do not understand the cognitive side of the problem well enough in non-human animals. Depression in animals is associated with a lack of appetite, as well as eating too much, sleeping either too much or not enough, and general inactivity and withdrawal. And these physical manifestations in some respects seem similar to the concept of learned helplessness, which was originally observed in dogs in the late 1960s by the human psychologist Martin Seligman, who was attempting to study models of depression. He set up an experiment which found that dogs exposed to electric shock that they could not control learned to stop trying to avoid that shock when they were given the option to do so. Instead, they would lay down and whine when shocked rather than trying to escape. That lack of behavior is thought to be a sign that the dogs felt they could not affect negative events in their lives and so gave up trying, which may be similar to what happens in signs of depression during separation. Researchers have found that dogs with separation-related problems have a negative cognitive bias towards neutral events, and also that animals treated with the medication Reconcile and a behavior modification plan eventually showed less pessimistic cognitive bias. So hopefully the concept of depression will become clearer in the years to come, but either way, it's good to know that there are options right now for our dogs to improve the underlying internal states that could potentially lead to depressed behavior when alone. Physical problems can often seem unrelated to behavior problems, but treating physical discomfort and pain is vital to resolving separation-related problems, no matter how minor the issue is. In 2020, Dr. Mills published research stating that up to 80% of problem behavior cases at a variety of veterinary behavior clinics had a pain component. They found there were 4 possible associations between pain and problem behavior. One, that the problem behavior was actually completely the result of pain. 2, that the problem behavior did not fully resolve without treating the pain component because pain was the cause of a secondary behavior issue. 3, that pain could increase the negative reaction to a stressful situation. And 4, that dogs may be suffering and showing pain-related behaviors that do not impact their humans' lives and so go unnoticed and untreated. Additionally, Harvey et al. In 2019 found that dogs that were itching from atopic dermatitis showed more problem behaviors than those without the condition. There are so many people whose dogs are itching, and often people don't think it has anything to do with the intensity of unwanted behavior, but it often does. It is just not possible to know what portion of the behavior is due to pain or physical discomfort until that issue is no longer a factor. Mills and colleagues also stated that often the physical issues that are contributing to behavioral problems may be so minor that they are missed when the dog is first examined by a veterinarian. So they recommend treating suspected pain and then assessing whether there is an improvement in behavior. That's why finding a veterinarian sensitive to these issues is so important to the success of treatment efforts. All right, so a huge tool in our toolbox for addressing separation-related problems is predictability. Amat, Comps, Lebrecq, and Monteca in 2014 wrote that predictability should be a key component of treating separation-related problems. Whereas we used to believe that you should try to mix up departure cues in order to cause the dog to never know if you were coming or going, We now know that that strategy can create unpredictability, and unpredictability makes very unpleasant events worse. This has been found in many different species of animals, including humans. And this is called the safety hypothesis. And it says that knowing when a very unpleasant event will happen also tells the animal when it will not happen. When an animal cannot predict when something really unpleasant might happen, they can't be at ease, even when that thing isn't happening, which leads to chronic states of physiological distress. However, if you introduce cues in the wrong way, signaling a bad event can cause a frustration response. So we will discuss how to implement signals so that we minimize frustration in a moment. It is also important to understand that the more tip-offs we give to the animal, the better they can predict what is about to happen. And so they will remember that context if it is emotionally relevant to them, such as when it's unpleasant. This is one reason why we want to try to separate the place we train from where the animal may need to spend time during an emergency. Sometimes it's not possible to actually change the locations, but adding an emergency cue will help. And the more cues we add, the more context we create, and the more predictability we give our dogs. So now I want to cover an issue that comes up so frequently with people having separation-related problems with their dogs, and that is they're using a crate and have not just tried leaving the dog outside the crate in a dog-proofed room. Sometimes doing this alone will solve all your problems, so it's worth trying if you haven't. And I love crates. They are great for potty training and also wonderful safe havens, which are secluded den-like resting places as long as the door is left open. However, when the doors are closed, they tend to magnify separation problems, and the issue is not solved by formal crate training. Placing a dog in a crate creates another barrier, and so that's why there's often a frustration response. It may be possible to put a dog in a crate in an emergency situation if and only if it is already in use and the dog is not injuring themselves and they are also taking a situational medication that works. Otherwise, closed-door crates are just not helpful and can have a really negative impact on the dog's quality of life, safety, and your recovery efforts. Instead, we want to give the dog use of the couch or a comfy bed in a dog-proofed room. These options decrease that barrier frustration and give the dog more autonomy. The couch or bed options are another safety cue and are where you want to do your departure training process. Recovering from separation-related problems can take time. Each dog is different and progresses on their own schedule, and it's important to think through how you're going to live your life during that time so that the work is sustainable and your dog makes the most progress during training. To that end, I want to talk about different ways of managing your dog when you need to leave the house during the training process. Pet sitters can be the perfect solution for dogs who don't get along well with other dogs. You can advertise in college forums and often find students who are willing to study at your house or let you bring your dog to theirs. And having a few is very helpful in case one isn't available at the time. For dogs that do well with other dogs, daycare is a fantastic enrichment opportunity. And there are daycares that often have more structure and one-on-one attention for fearful dogs. Also, if neither of those options work or you need an additional one, you can consult with your veterinarian or a veterinary behaviorist to find a situational medication for emergencies. I have worked with a number of fosters where they aren't able to pay for daycare or sitters, but have the dog left in a different part of the house or with another emergency cue to protect our training. Plus, the dog is taking an effective situational medication, and this has worked extremely well. It's important to be able to have a camera to watch your dog to make sure that your dog is safe during this time. It's also important to find a medication that actually works for your dog if the first one doesn't. There are a variety of different medication options, and just like people, not every medication will work the same way on every dog. So talk to your veterinarian or work with a veterinary behaviorist. So how do we approach recovery from separation-related problems? I like to think of the overall plan as the three T's: treat, train, and track. I'm going to make sure that all known and suspected physical issues are checked out thoroughly by a veterinarian. Additionally, I will often want to enlist the aid of a veterinarian familiar with behavior modifications to assess any potential psychological conditions that add to chronically high arousal and negative emotions during periods of separation. Having a vet that's really sensitive to treating pain and physical discomfort, as well as familiar with different types of anxiety medications, is extremely helpful. Then I'm going to work to decrease negative emotional responses in the dog by making the leaving alone process very clear and also very relaxed. I want to work on providing clear contextual cues to the dog in a way that will not be too overwhelming for them. And I'll tell you how I do that in a moment. However, I want to focus on building relaxation while desensitizing and habituating the dog to the departure process. And finally, I'm going to track all my steps in my training plan, as well as the dog's responses and any health, exercise, or enrichment the dog received, anything out of the ordinary that happens each day, and any time alone outside of training to watch for trends over time. A Google spreadsheet is very useful for this process. So now let's talk about the training process. We can use multiple signals during the training process to let the dog know that they can relax. These include things like allowing the dog up on the couch if they're not showing aggressive behavior on it, as well as providing them with an open door crate or comfy beds. You can use multiples of these in different locations where you think they'll be most comforting for your dog. Use the radio or television or white noise to block out sounds of the environment and that might trigger your dog. Use odors that are relaxing or that smell like people the dog feels safe with. You can leave out toys, especially if your dog is already able to relax during training. Cover windows that may have people or other dogs walking by that could increase the dog's arousal or sense of concern. And you will also use what I call a safety cue object, as well as warm-ups during your training process, which I will be explaining further soon. Finally, if you do need to leave the dog alone in between training sessions, it's very important to have an emergency situation signal as well. And you could have multiples of these, but these could be leaving your dog somewhere other than where you're doing the training, as long as they don't injure themselves, or putting up an emergency situation signal like a scarf on the door, which I'll talk more about in a second. So when we start our training process, the very first thing we're going to do is to put out our safety cue. And this is an object that should be obvious to the dog, which won't be played with like a toy. Try to make it something they've never seen in your house before. One of my clients went out and got an orange traffic cone, which was such an awesome idea. I decided to start using this after hearing a great webinar series by the vet behaviorist, Dr. Sarah Heath. However, I introduced it in a way that fits my training process, which I think takes some of the guesswork out of it and does not create frustration, which is the main concern some people have with using this type of cue. The safety cue will only be used during the departure training, which is a gradual process. The safety cue also teaches the dog that you will not be paying direct attention to them, but that you will be sitting with them and then departing and then returning. And this cue and training process tells the dog they can relax, they will be safe. Remember, it's the first thing that comes out and the first thing to be put away. And while it's out, you pretend like you don't have a dog while completing the other steps of the training. If you must attend to your dog, put it away first. Eventually, you'll be able to put out this signal and then leave, and it will be a constant visual reminder to the dog that you are leaving and coming back in a way that will not be upsetting to them. Now let's talk about the emergency cue a little more. I saw this on Reddit and it says, my friends have a dog with separation anxiety and someone suggested they get a dummy while we're away to make the dog feel better. And they sent them this, and I cannot stop laughing. And I was like, what a perfect emergency cue. So again, we're using all the predictability cues at our disposal here to help decrease anxiety. I would always suggest using situational medications to help your dog cope with being left alone longer than they are ready for and to minimize frustration. But an emergency cue can also be very helpful. Remember, use this specific object or context only during emergency situations and never use it in your departure training practice. The emergency cue, as opposed to the safety cue, tells the dog, I will be leaving and returning, and you're going to have to cope with a period of time you may not be ready for. Always put it out as the last thing you do before you leave and put it away as the first thing you do when you return. You can also put the dog in a different room than just where you're doing your training, and then also put out an additional emergency cue, like I said before, a scarf on the door, just before you go to help protect your training location. The emergency cue, along with anti-anxiety medication, has been extremely helpful to some clients, such as foster dog parents who just have to leave the dog alone in between training, as well as single people who need to leave their house once in a while without a daycare or sitter lined up. And here is a client update I got after working with someone for 6 weeks. They had 2 dogs with separation-related problems and used safety and emergency signal objects depending on the situation. They said, I have been attempting more absences with the emergency object, and while a few didn't go well, there were quite a few that actually went very well, including the most recent today, in which I left for 2 hours and 10 minutes, and there was no barking, whining, or panicking. While they did some sitting at the gate, they also chilled in various spots around the room on the couch, chair, and floor. One of the most important differences between dogs showing separation-related problems and those that do not is something that is probably self-evident. That dogs without separation-related problems show relaxed behavior like snoozing and resting a lot more frequently than those with separation-related problems. Many video studies have found these differences in behavior patterns. Dogs with separation-related problems showed the most intense levels of activity right after the owner had left the house, mostly vocalization and destruction. Some studies found no decrease in activity over time, and others found that distressed behaviors popped up again in 23 to 28-minute cycles. And others found that some behaviors, like vocalization and destruction, tended to decrease over time, but that anxious behaviors like panting tended to increase over time, indicating that frustration was evolving into fear and anxiety. In contrast, dogs without separation-related problems did not show high levels of activity right after the owner left and rarely explored familiar places unless they noticed something or someone new, and then they went back to resting while alone. So if we want our dogs to be like the relaxed ones, we have to get them to act that way. We need to retrain them to enjoy relaxing while we're away. How do we do that? Through desensitization and habituation. Desensitization is exposure to something the dog fears, which occurs not only gradually, but also involves pairing the feared event with a response that will counteract that fear, such as relaxation. Desensitization works well for social fears and anxieties. Habituation is a decrease in the strength of an elicited response following repeated presentations of something that would trigger it. So habituation works well for fears of inanimate objects, such as sounds like the door opening and closing. So when we want to help dogs overcome separation-related problems, we have to teach them how to first relax when they're getting ready to be left alone, and second, when they're actually alone. In our training, we will work in small enough steps that the dog chooses to relax around everything that we do, and we will repeat sounds and cues associated with leaving enough times that the dog no longer alerts to those things or alerts very little. By repeatedly coming back to sit with the dog after little steps towards the door, the dog learns that although he's not getting active attention from you, You are returning to be with him, and most dogs find this very reassuring, which helps to build that relaxation. So here are the general steps of the training process. Decide where you will leave your dog when you're not at home, and remember, trying to leave your dog in a crate with the door closed is not likely a relaxing enough place if they don't already love being crated with the door closed. Instead, choose either a couch or an area where you repeatedly settle with your dog during the day. Some people will sit at their desk, as the dog naturally likes to sleep under the desk, but most people will use the living room, and most dogs will rest at their feet or on the couch. When you start your training session, always put out this safety cue first. Remember that the dog is learning when the cue comes out, you will sit with him, but you won't be speaking to or making eye contact with him. This helps the dog choose to relax nearby on their own. Eventually, they understand that you'll be leaving when this cue comes out, but that is a gradual association as the training continues. Then pull out your laptop and open up a spreadsheet where you write down everything you do and also what your dog does on camera. For instance, through Zoom or Google Meet. It's really helpful to have an up-close view of your dog's face and body when you have your back turned so that you can see how relaxed they are. And you can, join on a cell phone and put your camera right in front of the dog. Start with standing and sitting again, and then add anywhere between 1 to 3 steps towards the door. And just do that until your dog has decided to find a resting location and stops following you. Don't tell your dog where to be or force them to stay in one place. They're allowed to move around, but their reactions will determine how many steps we are building towards the door. As you go, you'll gradually add more and more steps. And remember that all the steps you take should be towards the exit door. It's important not always to make your distances longer and longer, especially in the beginning of the session. You need to do a number of easy steps first and then build as your dog is looking calm and resting. Easy steps provide a mental break for your dog, and longer steps are a challenge. So mix up easy steps in between more challenging steps. However, what is considered easy should change over time. Each time you stand up from the couch, sit back down again, and sometimes wait a bit longer before you get up again, especially in the beginning of the training session, so the dog has time to settle if they were slightly vigilant when you walked away. This also gives you time to write down the dog's reaction while you were up. If you work in this gradual way, that you will find that your dog relaxes as the session progresses, so you can train for between 20 to 40 minutes each time. I would suggest training between 3 to 5 times per week. We usually don't use food in this training because we want the dog to learn how to cope with you moving away rather than not paying attention because of the distraction of the food. Plus, you won't be able to give food when you're not there. There are some limited times, though, relating to using gates when I will use food when returning, but that's very unusual. And don't work right before times your dog is expecting to be fed or walked or do some other energizing activity. Make sure all their needs are taken care of before the training starts. In the beginning days of training, you may find that training at some times of the day is easier than others. Work when your dog is likely to be most relaxed, and as your dog progresses at those times, you can work during more realistic periods of the day. Slow and steady wins the race. I will usually start with around 30 to 50 repetitions of these little behaviors of moving towards and eventually starting to open the door during each session, which usually takes between 20 to 40 minutes. These repetitions are called warm-ups, as they warm the dog up to the process of you leaving. The last repetition of the training session should be the hardest one. You may do the same thing a few times before the last rep, but always gradually build towards the hardest step at the end, and then end there for the day. You will rate your dog based only on the final repetition of the day's session. Here's my rating scale for early training sessions. 1, does not follow to the door. Head remains down, body settled, eyes not vigilant when people leaving or are gone, no whimpering. 2, alert, raises head, watching people leave until they return. Gets up to go to the person. And 3 is gets up to go to the person, barking, panting, howling, pacing, urinating, or digging. Okay. So based on the last repetition of the day, I can tell whether tomorrow I will be repeating, building to the same final behavior, dropping back to a previous behavior and level of difficulty, or moving to the next hardest step in my overall plan of leaving. I know it may seem like this process is really, really gradual, and it is, but getting relaxation does not actually add more time to the total training process. And it helps the dog learn to relax and puts you on solid ground for building time alone. So here is an example. So they're sitting on a couch next to Charlotte, and there's 3 different views. And you can see Charlotte's response on 1, which is the watching the dog's response video camera. They have their camera, which is showing what they're doing. And they're just going outside and fiddling with the door because they're getting her used to the sound of the door locking and unlocking with the door open, right? So they're breaking down the triggers by doing this. And they are mixing up what they're doing, but it's not like they go and do this throughout the day at random times, right? This is a training session. We have started with the safety cue being put out, and then a bunch of other things have happened in succession that tell Charlotte we are doing this training now. This is the training happening. But then within that, you do mix things up a little bit to give the dog more challenging situations and steps, and then easier steps in between. So now I'm speeding up because otherwise it would be like an hour-long, training session.
What is the safety cue?
For them, it was a Yoda figure that they put out. It's not visible in these videos.
Oh, okay.
On the side of the wall, like right in front of her bed, basically, so she can see it. And then, it's not only like that, that is the first cue. So always put your new cues first, right? So the first tip off is the one that they will start learning, leads to everything else. But even if they don't get it right away, all those other things they're doing, like getting their shoes on, sitting on the couch, getting up, walking to the door, and doing these warm-ups, those are all cues too that tell her what is happening, right? So now they've actually gotten in their car and they have driven away. This is the final repetition of the session, and she is snoozing as they do that final duration. Then they come back, they put all their stuff away, and then they come back into the house and another thing is, like, they put the TV on. We like to have like the TV or the radio on during our training sessions, which you would turn on after you put out your safety cues. So the cue comes first. Okay, so that is it.
Now, Olga mentioned that she didn't see them putting the cue out every time they come and go.
Right, you don't do that. You put it out at the very beginning of the session, and then you put it away at the end of the session. Okay, so when we start training, we're simply going to put on our shoes right after putting out the safety cue, and then proceed with training and take them off at the end. But as the days go and the dog doesn't care about our shoes, we'll continue to add other accessories, usually right when we would put on our shoes. So the other main accessories are usually your coat and bag. And keys are slightly different, and you'll start by incorporating them into the session by picking them up and setting them down a few times throughout the session, and after a few days of training with just your shoes. I would not start keys until you've got a few training sessions under your belt. After that, you can start to pick them up every time you go, before you go to the door, and put them down on your way back. And I would not start to lock or unlock the door and with the keys until after you're able to walk out the door without the dog getting distressed. So things like trash can also be incorporated similarly to keys, but you would just do trash in some sessions. You don't need to do it in every single session that you do. Okay. So the biggest problem that I see with people trying to do this on their own is that they do not build relaxation into the desensitization process and end up sensitizing the dog rather than desensitizing them. And this is why it's so important to have a camera in front of your dog. Don't worry if you think the dog will get weirded out, they will get used to it. It may become another contextual cue. Watch your dog's eyes and head. Your dog should remain resting most of the time. They may raise their head to watch you, which is fine, but you want to see them relaxing more and more through the repetitions until they are at a 1 on the final repetition for the day. Over time, look for your dog's eyes to become relaxed before you return to them or after you leave. Snoozing is good. Don't be afraid that they're missing the training session. They would wake up in a second if you push too quickly. So now I'm going to show you another video on early learning versus skill acquisition. The first example, the dog notices the person at the door doing things, and she is vigilant until the person returns. You can see she's watching, her ears are back until her owner sits. Then she lowers her head. Then she takes a deep breath and she nuzzles into that blanket. So you can see how her behavior shifts when her owner gets back. Here's another example of early learning. So she hears her owner at the door. She has whale eye and wide eyes. Her ears perk up. She's listening. Now, most people would say this dog is relaxing on the couch. She's relaxed, but she's not relaxed. She's vigilant right now. And you'll see that she stays vigilant for a while until the person sits again. Then she starts to relax. So this is early learning. These dogs haven't acquired the skill yet, but they are on their way. And so after the person sits, she stretches, and she also does a big exhale because her person is back with her. Okay, so that's early learning. Now, after acquiring the skill, you're going to see the dog relax before the person returns, right? So his eyes opens because he hears the people at the door, which is just normal. Any animal's going to respond to something happening. But what we're looking for is that his eyes relax before people return. So we know he's really getting the idea of what we're trying to teach. So here come the people, but his eyes have already relaxed. Then they sit, and he notices them for a second because he feels the couch, but then he goes back to snoozing. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. Also, relaxation after the person leaves. Okay, so here we have Charlotte again, and you can see Charlotte is noticing what they're doing. She notices them leave. You can see her watching. Her eyes get bigger as they leave. But then her eyes relax after the door closes. So she is learning how to relax after the door closes. And you can see what they're doing at the bottom of the screen. They're coming back in, and she will notice them again. Look, those eyes get real big. She notices them coming back, but that's fine because she relaxes afterwards.
What happened?
And there's a little bit of audio in this. So she's snoozing again. They're going to do it one more time here. So you can see the pause between the repetitions. This is about how long it should be. She notices them leaving again, but her eyes are even more relaxed this time because this is the second time she's done this. This is what we call warm-ups. This is the purpose of warm-ups. But then her eyes close after they leave. So that's fantastic. That is what we want to see. Okay. And then they're going to come back in because they're doing their warm-ups. And she's going to notice them again because she's an alive being. But after that, she's going to go back to snoozing. Okay. So that's what we're looking for. That's the difference between early learning and skill acquisition. Okay. And so one of the big things that we have to do while we're doing this process, especially when things are complex, is to break down the triggers to the best of our ability. to see what specifically might be bothering the dog. And we can test this out during our training sessions. For instance, is the dog triggered during your walk to the door, or is it the door opening sounds that get him? Is it the sound of the garage door opening, or is it the fact that you're standing outside during that time? Did your dog just get a course of medication that might be making them not feel so great and their behavior is more clingy because of that? You have to track these things and figure out what might be the source of the issue so you can desensitize, habituate, or address it in some way. And I had a client who gave a course of dewormer, and over the time, the dog's response to being left alone had regressed. But once they stopped, it improved again. So it's amazing what these little things will do. We want to get our dogs to the point where they are truly relaxed with all departure stuff before we start building time, so we can build on as firm a ground as possible. Once you start to build time, you need to know how long you can extend during each session. So don't try to keep extending time every time you train. Throw in easier and shorter sessions in between the longer ones, and only extend like 2 to 3 times a week. Also, keep mixing up the number of warm-ups you do, especially as they get shorter and shorter over time. So sometimes you might do 15, sometimes you might do 5, but you started out doing 50 when you were first training. So even though it's going to shrink over time, you still want to mix it up the whole time. Also, be nearby and watching at the start of the new amount of time so that you can come in early if your dog isn't completely comfortable yet. It is not the end of the world if you have to come in early. Your dog does not forget everything they've learned. They may just be at a certain point. And generally, if your dog is under 2 minutes, you can extend in 1 to 10 second increments. If you are working from 2 to 9 minutes, you can extend in 15 to 30 second increments at a time. If your dog is somewhere between 10 to 29 minutes, you can extend in 5-minute increments. And if your dog is between 30 to 89 minutes, you can extend in 10 to 15-minute increments at a time. Finally, if your dog can go between 90 minutes to a full day, you can extend in 15 to 30-minute increments. Every dog is an individual, and some dogs can turn around really quickly, whereas others with more severe and complex problems can take much longer. It's not abnormal to have setbacks, and I think you just have to know that these are temporary and your dog will get through them and come back stronger if you respond well. I will give you an example here in a second. But there are blips, plateaus, and regressions sometimes. Everyone has bad days. There may have been a number of stressors that all came together and caused your dog to have a bad day. Try again later. Also, start to track things like weather changes and pain and discomfort to see if there are changes over time. Relating to plateaus, be close to home so you can return if your dog shows signs of distress. And also, don't forget to mix up your time periods. Finally, regressions happen. Go back to some easier sessions for a while and try to isolate potential triggers. Talk to your vet about medications that could help, or a veterinary behaviorist, and always address any physical issues. So I'm going to talk about some case histories now. The first one is Cole, this beautiful Black German Shepherd who was adopted as a puppy during the pandemic in September of 2020. And he would break out of his crate and start barking and whining when left alone. And so the people just really couldn't leave the house. They were able to suspend absences in between training to protect that training through the use of doggy daycare. And they trained with me for about 3 months. He was only on a calming care probiotic and no other medications. They didn't want to do medications. But he was on that before I started working with them. And we trained for 33 days on working on the pre-departure routine and noises outside the house, including their set of double doors. And after 3 months of training, he was resting comfortably for 1 hour and 15 minutes alone. And he's now at 3.5 hours and will be moving to 4 hours very soon. So here's his training graph. And you can see that the first 23 days, we just worked on building relaxation during that pre-departure routine and getting him used to all the sounds of, the doors opening and closing. After day 23, we worked on external cues outside the house as they were walking through the gate and, coming up the walk, that kind of thing. And after 33 days, he jumped to 37 minutes alone and continued to progress to an hour and 15 minutes. I can sometimes have people progress much faster just when they're working with me, and I can see how relaxed the dog is. But if you want to be very conservative as you're doing this for the first time on your own, that's where I would definitely stick to those time increment increases, okay? But I could see that we had a major breakthrough because they started writing that during the training session, he would leave the room to go upstairs. And they were like, he's so bored. And I'm like, that's exactly what we want. So that was a breakthrough. And I've seen that in other dogs too. So that's a great sign. Here's another case history, Charlotte. And this is a very different case. So she's a 6.5-year-old spayed female mixed breed. She was adopted at a shelter and found as a stray running at large with a very dirty coat. She was adopted on September 25th, and the people in her foster home were always at home, so nobody realized she had any separation issues. But she began showing signs of separation-related problems after adoption. She would pace around the house, whining, peeing on the carpet, and repeatedly jumping up on all the windows. So we used a safety cue, which they used a little Yoda figure that they would put out and still put out. They were able to suspend absences through the use of pet sitters. And we worked for 25 days on the pre-departure routine, including double doors and building relaxation. Then we worked for 38 more days working on the departure noises outside the house. And Charlotte seemed to be exceptionally vigilant about noises outside the house after her folks departed. And so because of that, we needed additional medication for her to progress because of those fears of the environmental threats. After 9 months, she is currently at 5 hours of alone time very comfortably. And here's her training graph. So you'll see in here, they began training on October 24th, and I thought she seemed really itchy. On 11/15, they started her on an anti-anxiety medication, and she had a lot of health issues during the whole training process, which I think slowed her down a lot. And December 16th through the 29th, she started treatment for a skin infection and a spider bite. On January 31st, she began treatment for allergies and a yeast infection, which they couldn't even see, the yeast infection. February 8th, they stopped all her allergy medication, I think because of some miscommunication with the vet. On February 24th, they started a situational anti-anxiety medication. And on March 28th, they restarted the allergy medication. On April 4th, they stopped the situational anxiety medication because it was causing her to have urine accidents while she was sleeping. And you would think that the regression that you can see here would have happened right when she stopped the situational medication, but it actually happened before that on March 27th. And it was tough to see that. But we went back to baby steps for about a month, and then she started making massive progress again on May 8th. So on April 28th, she started a different situational medication and also had a major upset stomach and had to go to the emergency vet. And she had been having these stomach issues for a while before she ended up in the vet. So they stopped giving her allergy medication on May 3rd to rule out the issues causing her stomach problems. And her stomach issues actually resolved on May 8th. So you can see how rapidly she started making progress once the anxiety medication, the stomach issues, and the skin issues got worked out. And she has made so much progress, but she has had a very complicated road and has amazing caregivers. And the last story I want to show you I'll stop it there because I know your dogs are probably going crazy, but this is Jane, and Jane was a foster dog. You can see on the picture, it's a little hard to see, but you can see that she left puddles of saliva on the floor and destroyed the door at her foster home. And here's her background. She was surrendered for the second time on February 6th and had really bad skin issues when she was surrendered, which they started treating immediately at the shelter. She was chewing on the fencing in her run at the shelter and jumping at the door, whining, crying, trying to escape. She was actually nipping and biting people to avoid being confined in her kennel. And on March 5th, she was placed in a foster home. The foster had another dog that she was a little too rough with sometimes, so she needed to be left separated when the foster wasn't at home. And in the foster home, Jane, as you saw before, scratched the door and damaged the door frame trying to escape. She whined, wailed, howled, screeched, and panted when left alone and urinated several times. And she was transferred to another foster home on April 7th, but returned to the shelter on the 23rd due to vomiting and diarrhea, and tried to bite the staff when they were placing her back in her kennel. So there's some of that immediate frustration coming in. And she was also lunging and trying to escape. And the vet techs who were treating her reported that she then bit metal on the door and the frame and began screaming and barking in the kennel. So the original foster took her back on May 4th, and she was still showing all of these separation problems and also pretty intense jumpy mouthy behavior. And she was using situational anti-anxiety meds since she came to the shelter because for various stressful situations. And they started her on an allergy medication for itchiness on February 18th and an anti-anxiety medication on April 28th. And I began contact with the foster on May 11th about my behavior recommendations. I recommended working very closely with the shelter vets to treat all the visible rashes on her belly and her continuing itchiness. And they had already tried to treat this. So it just needed more. And the vets did a great job at the shelter. They put her on a prescription diet. They gave her allergy treatments and medicated baths. And that really, really made a big difference in those allergies. So here's her training graph. I worked with the foster on desensitization and habituation between June 10th and August 3rd with a safety cue, which was a golf club. And we did 4 Zoom sessions together, and I provided the foster with 21 training plans, which she did on her own. And on June 28th, the vets added an additional situational medication that was only used when the foster had to go to work. After 7 weeks of work, she was resting very comfortably during her training sessions for 2.5 hours and able to stay comfortably at home for 8 hours with additional situational medication. So here's Jane. So you can see this is her last 2.5 hour training session. All right, she did great. And then this is her at home during real life as the foster is at work after treatment. So there you go. There's Jane. And Jane was adopted. So far, everything is going amazingly well, and her family completely adores her. So there you go. So thank you so much for joining me today and putting up with these technical issues. I hope the presentation has given you more insight into this fascinating and complex issue. And if you would like to get in touch with me, here's my contact information. You can schedule a complimentary half-hour phone consultation with me to discuss your situation. And I'm always happy to help. Additionally, I will be teaching an online separation-related problems class through Your Dog's Friends starting September 11th and running for 6 weeks. And you can register online through their website. So thank you, everyone.
That's great. I'm glad you got that plug in. Okay, here are a few questions that have come in already.
Okay.
Does the safety cue need to be out of reach of the dog?
It should be somewhere that's very obvious to the dog. You want to try to choose something that is not going to be something they want to grab and play with, right? So, you know, I know it depends on the dog, but maybe use like more of a heavier, very stable object for dogs that tend to want to grab, you know, traffic cones or something along those lines. So it could be outside of the reach of the dog, but it needs to be very visually apparent to them.
How long did the owners work with the dogs in the early learning slide to get their dogs to relax on the couch?
Yeah, usually between like 21 and 25 days. And, you know, the relaxation on the couch comes way sooner than that. So I'm talking about just to get them out the door, right? So their dog is relaxed and they're out the door by 21 to 24 days. So yeah, you can get the dog to, I can get the dog to relax on the couch in like the first session, basically. And we do that by doing those little steps, right? And coming back and sitting with the dog in between each of those reps. So the dog stops being frantic because they start to understand the process in the game.
Someone else wants to know if you have ever had success with owners who are not able to suspend absences.
Yes, and that is exactly what I was talking about with the foster who had to go to work several days a week. So what we did is that we got the dog on a situational anti-anxiety medication that works, that is effective. It may not completely take away every anxiety, but it really brings them down. And then we also put out a an emergency cue, which could be like a scarf on the door, or also just putting the dog in a different part of the house than you're going to do their training is another great option, because that context is so different that the dog, you protect the training location that way. But I've had success, like I said, that other client who, you know, she was doing all the desensitization. So I think that was really an important part of the process. But then she had to go out of the house sometimes. And so she had the dogs on some anti-anxiety medication, and she would put out a scarf on the doorknob. And then that was her emergency cue, and she would leave. And over time, over a few sessions, the dogs really got the idea, and they started to do that relaxed behavior even in the emergency situation. So I've seen it multiple times. So I just think it's important to get some anti-anxiety medication on board if you're going to have them in that, you know, left alone situation.
Someone else says that they are working on separation anxiety, and we notice that their dog will go to the door once they are gone and sleep, relax. Does his going to the door indicate that he is still not comfortable being left alone, even though he is sleeping?
Yeah, so I think I think it's on a spectrum. So yes, I think it does indicate some discomfort. And so I would definitely continue to work on maybe a tweak to a medication, also maybe going back and doing some shorter absences, and just building up the dog's confidence a little bit more. But I think that over time, like, you're moving in a good direction, but you may need to be a little more conservative for a while to help him build more confidence, or tweak some anti-anxiety medications that the dog's getting to help with that aspect of things too. So it is so much better than the original behavior, but I do think that it indicates some level of discomfort.
Liv says that she's not sure if her dog has issues relaxing or not. When she leaves, he cries for 10 to 30 seconds, self-soothes and sleeps in his crate with interactive toys like stuffed Kongs. The barking crying is so brief that she's not sure if it's something to work on.
Okay. Well, I would just continue to watch it. And if you notice that it's getting longer and longer, then I would work on it. I think if the dog can go and lie down and soothe themselves, that's a good sign. But you can also work on a desensitization program and just continue to give these signals, right? So the safety cue is a contract with your dog. And you use that only during your desensitization program, but then you can use that emergency cue when you're leaving for real. And that can really help, I think, to tell the dog what to expect, because it could be that the dog is really has their expectations upset. They don't anticipate you leaving. And they're frustrated or they're anxious about that. So there's ways to work on it. Even if it's not the worst situation in the world, and that could really actually help the dogs relax before you leave or just right after you leave.
There's also a comment about diet affecting health, like allergies and itching and stomach issues, but also behavior.
Yeah,
diet
can
anxiety.
Have a huge impact, especially if you're noticing your dog with those stomach issues like vomiting, diarrhea, or other allergies. That is definitely a thing. And sometimes there are I'm not a veterinarian, so I don't get into a lot of details on this, but I would talk to your veterinarian about a single protein diet, potentially, but your vet will have very good recommendations on that. But it's definitely a thing. It's definitely something that can cause distress and then add to those behavioral issues.
We have a video on our YouTube page under, I think, the health section about health and, about food and behavior. So if you want to take a look at that sometime. What if your dog just follows you to the door when you're trying to begin the training process?
Okay, great question. So that's where you want to take those baby steps, right? So I said, just stand up and sit down a few times, mix it up between one step, coming back and sitting down, 2 steps, coming back and sitting down, stand up, sit down, 3 steps, coming back and sit. You might need a week or 4 sessions to get yourself all the way to the door. But it's worth putting in that time, because otherwise you're just you don't get any of that relaxation going, right? But you can do it. You can totally do it. I do it with everybody. So it's kind of amazing, actually, to watch.
Juliet would like you to explain the difference and why the training versus the emergency objects are different. Wait a minute. Oh, I see. There are 2 different things here. One person is confused about the difference between safety cues and emergency cues and when and how to use each.
Okay. So, okay.
And the other question seems to be this: can you explain the difference and why the training versus the emergency objects are different? That's basically the same question, I think.
Okay, sure, yeah. So research has found that giving our dogs predictability during unpleasant events decreases anxiety, because they know when they're going to happen and they can relax when they're not happening. And over time, that improves cortisol and all those stress measures. So it makes them relax in general. So the safety cue tells the dog, it's your contract with the dog that says, I am only going to leave you for an amount of time that I know you're comfortable with. So I am going to be working on going to the door, going out the door, leaving eventually, but I'm not going to throw you over your threshold. And if you see the video that I showed about, and the slide on how to know if your dog is working in the right, or the slides on how to know if your dog is working at the right level, that's where you've got to stay during your training sessions. If you are, and it's okay if your dog gets up sometimes, but you have to back off if that happens. And so that's how you know that your dog is comfortable. And then you just work at that level and gradually build up. But before you start your training session, the very first thing you do, the biggest tip off to your dog should be that safety cue, right? That cone that comes out, and then everything else starts. So the dog will start to understand, oh, the cone's coming out. Okay, we're going to do that relaxation thing where she goes out the door, right? And then you put it away when you're done so that the dog knows that period of time is over. So that tells your dog you're going to be alone, but everything's okay. Now, if you are going out because you've got to go somewhere and you can't help it, there are those times. And so the way we can help our dogs with those times is also to give them some predictability around those times too, which over time lessens their anxiety. But we don't want to use the same cue that we used for our training session. So we want to have a different object that we put out during emergencies only. So like a paper on the back of the door right before you leave, or a scarf on the doorknob right before you leave, or putting your dog in another location that is not where you do your training and then putting something on the door. That is what I would suggest, because again, it's giving your dog predictability. Even though it is not a fun situation, it's still better than not being able to know when a bad thing is going to happen, right? So that's why that safety cue and that emergency cue are so important. And I would say that, there is a real issue with creating frustration when your dog can anticipate what's going to happen. So when you're leaving them alone during the emergency situation, I think it's so helpful and important to have some anti-anxiety medication on board for them to help them cope and to decrease that frustration response.
Which brings us to the next question, which is, Deb's dog is back on medication for anxiety. Is this going to be for life?
It really depends on the dog. That is something that, there's a real effect of learning during this process. So I have to say, I've experienced it in my own life. I have, there are times when I've taken anti-anxiety medications for performance, and then I learned I don't have to feel so bad. But sometimes these responses are physiological. You cannot control them. It's just, that the context, and then you feel this way. So that's where an anti-anxiety medication can really help, because you stop automatically feeling that anxious response. And over time, you learn, oh, I can feel good in this situation. And so for some animals, like myself included, I didn't have to continue taking that anti-anxiety medication forever, because I learned how to feel okay in that situation. But there are animals that have other underlying fears and anxieties, like the ones to noises and, external triggers. They may always need an additional medication to help them, and so it's really an individual thing, and one that you should work with your veterinarian on. But I know there are vets that will wean the dogs off of the meds, and I also know there are vets that will keep the dogs on the meds for years at a time. It just depends on whether the dog is doing well or not.
Okay. What kind of camera can you use for this training?
You can use your own laptop with a camera on it. Usually that's what I have clients use. And then I just get a free Zoom account or a free Google Meet account. And they can watch their dogs on their cell phone, because I'll join with their cell phone and their laptop. And then they can put the laptop in front of the dog, and then they can work on their, by watching their cell phone.
Okay. Nancy has an 8-year-old rescue, and what she wrote is that she doesn't understand when you leave for a brief period and the dog starts howling, barking, whining, you say to come back in. I don't understand how this works. It seems to me that this just trains your dog to know that you'll come right back if he starts to whine?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we are trying to get to the dog to the point where when we're actually leaving the house, we're not getting that, right? So if your dog is howling and whining when you've left the house, you're working at a level that's too difficult for them. So that's where that building relaxation really comes into play. You need to work on that first for, 25 days or, whatever it takes your dog to really be relaxed. And then you also need to look at what are the other factors affecting the dog's behavior. And there are some dogs that, may not be fully desensitized to all of the cues that you're leaving. So you need to go back and work on that a little bit more until they really don't care. You might need an anti-anxiety medication to help with some of those underlying sensitivities and fears. But you're not going to teach the dog that every time they whine, you come back in if it doesn't happen very often, right? So if you're working at a level where your dog is not doing that, then you're not going to teach them that. And if that is happening, then something needs to change in an earlier process of the training session so that you're not doing that. But coming back and when they whine is the best thing to do if it does happen, because otherwise you're going to teach them that things are not okay. And it's just as they feared, right? It's just as they thought might be the case, that they're actually not okay. But, they're not okay before they start whining. So there may be something that you're missing in the pre-departure or the early departure process. Like maybe their duration is not their time alone. It shouldn't be that long yet. Maybe they, all those other factors that I noted before. So you need to come back in when you hear the whining, because they're not whining to get you to come back in. They're whining because they're distressed. So you need to focus on why are they distressed and fix that. And then the whining won't happen. If you just let them whine, you're going to set yourself back a lot further. Now that's different in training versus your emergency situation, right? So if you have that training cue out, yes, you do need to do that. You need to come back in. If you have that emergency signal out, then you're telling the dog, this is what's going to happen. I'm sorry, you're going to have a time that you can't cope with, right? So those two signals really help the dog to figure things out and to learn to cope with these two different situations.
Olga wants a clarification of the safety cue. Do you use the safety cue during pre-departure training, like standing up from the couch or sitting down again? Or do you start doing it only when you're ready to leave using the door?
You do it at the very beginning of your training, before you've even worked all the way to the door. Right. So remember, we're spending a few weeks on getting all the way to the door, and, not just at the door, but through the door, out the door. Right. So you might get to the door the first day, but my point is that this safety cue comes out before you do anything. If you only put it out before you actually go out the door, then you're teaching the dog, this comes out when I leave you. And you don't have any of that relaxation associated with the cue. So that's why you need to put it out before you even start working at the door. When you're just taking those baby steps towards the door, that's when you put that cue out before you have your first training session, like to tip off that this training session is beginning, right?
Okay. What is the proper reaction to your dog when you return during the training and they are very excited to see you?
During the training, put your safety cue away first and then say hello to them. But it's very normal for your dog to want to greet you at the door. When they hear you coming back, they may get up and go to the door, and that's not a sign of separation problems. That's fine. But you do want to be very clear about what that cue means. So you put your cue away first, and then you attend to your dog. Okay.
And this is from a trainer, but I'm sure other people want to know, what if your client refuses to give anti-anxiety meds? Are there alternatives or natural options?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, there are some. There are some that you can try. I am blanking on the kinds. There's the Calming Care probiotic that Purina has. And there's, I apologize, I haven't thought about it in a while. There's one other one that you can do too. I think it's Rescue Remedy that you can do also. And yeah, you can try that and see if it's kind of, if they find that it makes a difference. And maybe that will open their mind to be more willing to try out other things. There's also like other supplements like Angstane, and Zilkine, which are like, additional supplements that you could ask them to talk to their veterinarian about as well, which are like L-theanine. So that could have a relaxing effect as well. But it is a process with some people. They don't want to do medication, and it's like got a lot of stigma attached to it. And so I think you have to do what they want to do, but those are some options. Yeah.
Okay. We have, again, on our YouTube channel, there is a section of talks from veterinarians that are like 10 minutes. And Dr. Ropsky did one on supplements that could be helpful. It's also at the end of some of the other webinars by the veterinary behaviorists. So if you look around, you will probably find some answers that could be helpful.
And Adaptil can be really helpful too.
Mm-hmm. There's a comment about Wise cameras also being a good, inexpensive camera that just uses a free app, WYZE.
Yeah, I have multiple Wise cameras at my house. I love them.
Oh my. And now there's a link to lots of cheap cameras you can get on Amazon. All right. Adaptil. Yeah, this is mentioning Adaptil and CBD Calm for dogs.
Yeah, CBD. Yeah.
CBD, there are good anecdotal stories. We have a webinar that Dr. Sin did on CBD, and she's less enthusiastic.
Interesting.
Yeah. It doesn't matter if it works for your dog, great.
Yeah.
There is one thing I want to mention. If you happen to be a local District of Columbia resident, Maryland, Virginia, in this area, the veterinary behaviorists have been backed up, which makes getting anxiety medication a little bit more tricky. However, and you heard it here first, Dr. Ropsky is moving to Friendship Animal Hospital in Washington, D.C., in Northwest D.C., and she has been a resident under Dr. Pike and is working just on behavior cases there. And she couldn't possibly be filled up yet. I think she is starting in September, but they may be taking appointments now for when she gets back. And also Dr. Pike, who I believe is in
Virginia.
In Manassas. Where is she?
Yeah, I would just said Virginia. I think.
Yeah, she's Northern Virginia somewhere.
Yeah.
But you can find her at the end of our trainer and veterinary behaviorist section on our website under resources. But she has a new clinical resident in behavior who just started with her. So that person can't be booked up yet either. So just a tip for those of you who, another thing is your your regular vet can call veterinary behaviorists for advice, and that can help with anti-anxiety meds too.
Yeah.
So do not despair if it looks like you can't get in for 4 months, because you'll be able to get in to see probably one of the newer practice, the clinical behavior that Dr. Pike has, or Dr. Robsky at Friendship, or your vet can contact Dr. Pike, Dr. Sen, pretty much any veterinary behaviorist will consult with your vet. I think we have probably come to the end of the questions.
Okay.
Pretty amazing. Okay, I think we're finished. Thank you again, Alexandra. Thank you, everyone who came. And
My pleasure.
we will see you next time. Next week is about reactive dogs in tight spaces.
Cool. All right, guys, take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.